The first time Janice Caldwell called me a stray, she was smiling. I'm Marin, 26 years old, an independent architect. Tonight was the grand family banquet at Whitlock House. I stood by the lavishly decorated banquet table, wearing a carefully chosen evening gown. But my stepmother immediately pointed a harsh finger toward the kitchen. Stray adopted girls don't eat with real family, she announced, her voice easily slicing through the wealthy guests' polite chatter. My stepbrother let out a mocking laugh, while my stepsister eagerly held up her phone, recording my humiliation. Instead of taking a seat, I was handed a tray and forced to serve appetizers to people staring at me with pity. Later, a waiter approached me, handing over the banquet's final bill, $3,270. I didn't scream. I didn't cry or beg for mercy. I simply smiled, pulled out my card, and paid it in full. My fingers gently brushed against the thick folder inside my bag. It held the official title deed to Whitlock House. My stepmother was busy showing off the luxurious mansion to her friends, completely unaware that the house no longer belonged to her. Before we get into my story, tell me what time you're watching this and what city you're in, so I know how far my story has traveled. If you've ever been treated like an outsider by your own family, be sure to hit like and subscribe. To understand why I stayed quiet that night, you need to know what Whitlock House was. It wasn't just a wealthy piece of real estate. It was an imposing, century-old mansion perched on the rugged cliffs of Newport, overlooking the dark waters of the Atlantic. Everything about the sprawling property screamed old money and legacy, right down to the towering wrought iron gates at the main entrance. Woven into the cold black metal was the name Whitlock. My biological parents were Daniel and Caroline Whitlock. They passed away in a tragic accident when I was barely old enough to form memories of their faces. Following their sudden death, I became an orphan, until Janice and Russell Caldwell officially adopted me. For a long time during my early childhood, I genuinely believed they were my absolute saviors. I thought they had rescued me from the foster care system, giving me a secure home out of pure kindness. The harsh reality of my place in their family became apparent very quickly. The Caldwells already had two biological children, Dean and Kelsey, who were treated like absolute royalty. They occupied massive sunlit suites on the upper floors, complete with private balconies. Meanwhile, I was quietly tucked away in a cramped, windowless room on the ground floor, located directly next to the loud laundry machines. It was a miserable space formerly used for staff quarters. Janice never raised a hand to strike me. She didn't have to. Her weapon of choice was absolute exclusion. She made sure I understood my exact place at the bottom of the hierarchy without leaving a single bruise. When professional photographers came for the annual family portraits, I was conveniently given chores in the garden. Consequently, my face never appeared on the grand staircase wall. My name was permanently absent from their luxurious Christmas cards. The kitchen staff would frequently forget to prepare a plate for me, leaving me to scavenge for leftovers. To the wealthy guests, Janice never introduced me as her daughter. She would gesture vaguely and say, "Oh, that's just the girl we took in." Russell Caldwell occasionally offered me a guilty smile or slipped me a $20 bill when his wife wasn't looking. He was capable of brief moments of kindness, but he never possessed the spine to actually protect me from Janice's systematic alienation. He simply watched it happen, turning a blind eye to keep the peace. As I grew older, certain details about my life in that house stopped making sense. I frequently stood outside and stared at the massive iron gates, asking Janice why the estate's entrance bore my exact surname. She barely looked up from her glossy magazine. "It's just an old name from the previous owners," she dismissed coldly, waving her hand. "Pure coincidence." The final crack in her constructed narrative happened on a quiet afternoon. I was sorting the mail and noticed an official envelope from the city's property tax department. Through the thin window, the addressee wasn't Russell or Janice Caldwell. It clearly said the estate of Daniel Whitlock. Before I could process the words, Janice lunged forward, aggressively snatching the envelope from my hands. Her face went pale with a sudden panic she couldn't hide. She locked it in her desk without a single word. That was the exact moment I realized this mansion was tied to my own bloodline, far more than my adoptive parents ever intended for me to discover. By the time I started working in real estate law, I had learned that houses keep records better than people do. My transition into adulthood was a sharp contrast to the lavish paths paved for my adoptive siblings. Dean never worried about student loans. Russell eagerly covered his expensive university tuition, bought him a luxury car, and handed him elite professional connections. Kelsey, on the other hand, benefited endlessly from Janice's deep pockets. My stepmother heavily invested in Kelsey's online image, purchasing top-tier cameras and renovating a guest room into a private broadcasting studio. I received absolutely nothing. I was expected to disappear quietly after turning 18. To survive, I funded my own education through grueling night shifts and eventually secured a demanding position as a paralegal at a prominent real estate law firm. The intense workload forced me to understand the brutal mechanics of property ownership. I quickly became intimately familiar with complex legal documents, spending my days analyzing deeds, executing meticulous title searches, digging through dense probate records, calculating property tax, and tracing the complicated chain of ownership. One afternoon, while routinely processing an archival file for a commercial client looking to expand in Newport, a familiar address suddenly flashed across the firm's old digital database. It was Whitlock House. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I pulled up the digitized historical records. I scrolled past the modern entries, digging deep into the archives until I found the original chain of title. There, etched permanently in the government registry, were the names Daniel and Caroline Whitlock. I didn't storm back to the mansion to confront Janice immediately. Throwing accusations without concrete, undeniable proof would only give her the opportunity to destroy evidence or hire expensive attorneys to silence me forever. Instead, I operated strictly in the shadows, using my firm's resources to begin a methodical, silent investigation into my own history. My persistent digging eventually led me to an independent practice run by Howard Mercer, a veteran estate lawyer who had personally worked with my biological parents decades ago. When I first visited his cramped, paper-filled office, he was incredibly cautious, refusing to answer a single question until I provided my official government identification and certified birth documents proving my direct family relationship to the Whitlock name. Once Howard verified my identity, his guarded demeanor softened into a mix of sadness and lingering anger. He pulled a yellowed file from a heavy cabinet and laid it firmly on his desk. He explained that my parents had absolutely left Whitlock House to me. According to the legally binding trust established before their accident, Janice and Russell Caldwell were never granted ownership. They were strictly appointed as temporary trustees and property managers meant to maintain the estate until I reached adulthood. The air in the office grew incredibly thin as the horrifying reality settled into my bones. I hadn't just been emotionally abused and treated like an unwanted outsider my entire life. I had been deliberately robbed. The Caldwells had hijacked my inheritance, living like royalty inside the walls that rightfully belonged to me. Howard gently closed the file, warning me that the Caldwells had likely manipulated the local system to obscure the trust over the years. He stressed the absolute necessity of officially confirming the exact legal loopholes they exploited through the county records. To accomplish this dangerous task, he immediately introduced me to a ruthless independent investigator named Vernon Pike. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope thick enough to feel expensive. It was delivered to my small apartment by a private courier, bearing the unmistakable aesthetic of my stepmother's extravagant taste. The heavy cardstock featured ornate gold lettering that boldly announced the Caldwell family name across the top. Unsurprisingly, there was absolutely no mention of the word Whitlock anywhere on the elegant paper. According to the flowing script, the grand family banquet was being hosted to formally celebrate Dean's recent engagement to his wealthy fiancée. However, a smaller line at the bottom caught my immediate attention. Janice planned to make a special toast regarding the future of the estate. The implication was crystal clear. My stepmother was preparing to publicly hand over the keys to Whitlock House to her golden son as a lavish wedding gift. She intended to solidify her stolen legacy by passing my rightful inheritance down to the next generation of Caldwells. Later that evening, Russell actually called me. His voice was unusually strained over the phone, lacking his typical passive tone. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Janice is under a lot of stress planning this event, he muttered. You should come, but only if you know how to behave appropriately. Don't say anything that might ruin Dean's big evening. I didn't argue. I simply agreed and hung up the phone. In that brief conversation, I realized my adoptive father definitely knew deep down that their arrangement was fundamentally wrong, yet he still cowardly chose to protect his biological family over doing the right thing. Fortunately, I was no longer an unprotected child. In Howard Mercer's secure office, we had spent weeks assembling an impenetrable legal arsenal. The veteran lawyer meticulously prepared a certified copy of the deed, a comprehensive title report, the definitive probate order, a formal letter clearly explaining my absolute ownership rights, and a draft eviction notice. Meanwhile, the ruthless investigator, Vernon Pike, had successfully confirmed every single detail directly through the county recorder's locked files. The Caldwells' fraudulent manipulation of the temporary trust was entirely documented and exposed in black and white. Initially, I hadn't wanted to cause a scene in front of their high society friends. I had preferred to handle the eviction through quiet legal channels. But Howard firmly advised against passive tactics. He explained that if Janice publicly declared false ownership of the estate in front of witnesses, it could complicate the immediate transition of power. If she attempts to give your house away, the lawyer warned seriously, you must respond immediately and legally correct the record on the spot. Taking his advice to heart, I chose to wear a deceptively simple, understated evening dress for the banquet. I didn't bother with expensive jewelry or flashy accessories. My only real accessory was the thick manila folder securely tucked inside my designer tote bag. Looking in the mirror, I reminded myself of my true purpose tonight. I wasn't going back to that mansion to beg for a proper seat at their table, nor was I going to seek their long overdue validation. I was simply going there to listen to Janice confidently tell her final, arrogant lie. The drive up the winding coastal road felt incredibly surreal. I kept the folder resting heavy on the passenger seat beside me. As my car finally crested the familiar hill, the imposing iron gates of the estate loomed into view. Beyond them, the massive ballroom windows of Whitlock House shone brightly against the dark night sky, ready for my arrival. That evening, Whitlock House looked exactly the way Janice wanted strangers to see it. The sweeping Newport mansion had been transformed into a breathtaking display of unimaginable wealth. Inside the massive ballroom, impossibly long mahogany tables were draped in fine silk and completely covered in towering arrangements of imported white flowers. Crystal glasses clinked continuously as sharply dressed waiters circulated with expensive vintage champagne. The elite guests, wearing custom evening gowns and tailored dark suits, mingled effortlessly, while the dark rolling waves of the ocean provided a stunning, dramatic backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Janice was busy playing the role of the perfect, gracious host, floating between groups with practiced elegance. Meanwhile, Kelsey was actively pacing around the room, holding her phone high to live stream the opulent event to her followers. She kept enthusiastically narrating short, highly edited clips about the enduring Caldwell family legacy. On the other side of the room, Dean stood with a glass in hand, loudly boasting to a group of wealthy investors. I could hear him confidently bragging that immediately after his upcoming wedding, he was fully preparing to take over the house and modernize the classic architecture. When I finally stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom, the lively atmosphere didn't falter, but the Caldwell family certainly noticed. Janice briefly locked eyes with me, her expression instantly freezing into a tight, unwelcoming mask before she quickly looked away. Kelsey immediately pivoted her body, deliberately angling her phone's camera to ensure I was completely excluded from her live broadcast. Eventually, Janice gathered the primary guests near the grand staircase for formal introductions. She proudly presented Dean as our bright future, gesturing to him and his fiancée. She affectionately called Kelsey our creative heart, praising her expanding digital influence. Finally, she placed a hand on Russell's shoulder, loudly declaring him the man who kept this family strong. However, as the polite applause faded, an older, clearly confused guest noticed me standing quietly near the edge of the gathering. He politely asked who I was and how I fit into the family dynamic. Janice's fake smile never wavered. "Oh, Marin grew up with us," she dismissed casually, waving her manicured hand in the air. "She's just the girl we took in after a terrible family tragedy." The older gentleman frowned slightly, looking around the crowded space. He innocently asked why there wasn't a designated chair for me at the main tables. Janice chuckled, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the surrounding chatter. "Stray adopted girls don't eat with real family," she announced smoothly, turning her attention back to me. "Marin, why don't you head into the kitchen and help the staff serve the appetizers?" Dean let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "Yeah, Marin always knew how to carry plates better than anyone else," he chimed in cruelly. I didn't react. I simply nodded, keeping my posture perfectly straight, drawing immense comfort from the heavy folder resting securely inside my bag. I walked away from the glittering crowd, heading toward the quiet, dimly lit hallway connecting the main ballroom to the kitchen. Before I could push through the swinging doors, I paused. Dean and Kelsey had stepped into the adjacent alcove, their hushed voices drifting toward me. "Once Dean officially takes the house next month," Kelsey whispered excitedly, "she won't have a single reason to ever show her face here again." Standing quietly in the cold shadows, the horrifying truth completely solidified in my mind. Janice didn't just want to publicly humiliate me one last time in front of her high society friends. She was actively plotting to erase my entire existence from Whitlock House forever. For a few seconds, the room was quiet enough for me to hear the waves outside the windows. Janice was the first to violently break the silence. "This is completely absurd," she shouted, her carefully crafted elegance completely melting into frantic desperation. She pointed an accusing finger at me. "You're being scammed by a fake lawyer, Marin." Next to her, Dean abruptly stood up from his chair, his face turning an angry shade of red as the humiliating reality of losing his extravagant wedding gift set in. Meanwhile, Kelsey desperately raised her phone to livestream her mother's defense, but she quickly stopped. For the first time, she realized dozens of wealthy guests had already pulled out their own devices and were actively recording the Caldwell family's epic public meltdown. Through all the chaotic shouting, Russell remained entirely silent. He sat completely frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with undeniable, paralyzing fear. I walked directly over to my adoptive father, forcing him to look at me. "How long have you known?" I asked firmly, making sure my voice carried across the ballroom. "How long did you know you were illegally living in my house?" Russell opened his mouth, but no words came out. His cowardly silence was the only answer I needed. Sensing Janice's continued resistance, Howard calmly opened his leather briefcase to deliver the final blow. He extracted a series of highlighted documents, holding them up for the surrounding crowd to see. "We have the certified letter sent to this exact address the day Marin turned 18, instructing the transfer of the estate," Howard announced loudly. "We also have the official postal confirmation proving Janice Caldwell personally signed for it, actively hiding it from the rightful owner. Furthermore, we recovered written email correspondence between Mrs. Caldwell and her former accountant, explicitly discussing how to quietly cover up Marin's legal ownership. To cement the undeniable truth, I pulled out my phone and played a short, recovered voicemail from that same accountant's archived files. Janice's sharp, unmistakable voice echoed thinly from the small speaker. "I don't care what the original trust says. I am not letting that stray girl take my house." The damning audio was the final straw. Sitting next to Dean, his beautiful fiancée, Natalie, stood up slowly. Her face was pale with pure embarrassment. Realizing her entire lavish wedding gift was nothing but a massive, humiliating lie, she didn't bother making a dramatic scene. She simply slipped the heavy engagement ring off her finger, placed it quietly on the table, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. "Effective immediately," Howard continued, projecting his voice over the murmuring crowd. "Janice and Russell Caldwell will receive a formal notice to vacate the premises. If the property is not vacated peacefully within the legal time frame, we will aggressively file a civil claim demanding years of unpaid occupation fees, total legal costs, and extensive financial damages for your deliberate fraud." I turned back to Janice, who was now visibly trembling. No one is being physically dragged out of the house tonight, I told her with cold composure. But from this exact second forward, all communication goes directly through my lawyers. You no longer have the right to ever call this the Caldwell house. Tears finally spilled down Janice's cheeks. She tried to grab my arm, playing the ultimate victim. Marin, please, she sobbed desperately. We put clothes on your back. We fed you. We raised you when you had absolutely nothing. I stepped back, completely unaffected by her manipulative performance. Raising a child doesn't give you the right to steal their house, I replied flatly. The show was officially over. Disgusted and thoroughly entertained, the elite guests immediately began gathering their coats and silently exiting the grand estate through the front doors. I turned and walked out alongside them, leaving Janice completely alone, standing in the middle of the massive ballroom she had just permanently lost control of. The legal part took longer than the dinner, and it was a lot less dramatic. Janice stubbornly refused to leave the sprawling estate immediately after the disastrous banquet. In response, Howard officially filed the civil claim and the formal eviction notice, following standard Rhode Island legal procedures to the exact letter. The Caldwells desperately tried to tell anyone in their social circle who would listen that I had forged the documents or been brainwashed by my attorney. However, the certified county records swiftly crushed their pathetic lies. A strict court order eventually mandated a settlement, legally forcing Janice and Russell to completely vacate Whitlock House within 30 days. I didn't show up to gloat or cause a physical altercation on their moving day. I simply waited until the legal deadline officially expired, and then I hired a team of professionals to change every single lock on the property. The social and professional fallout was absolute and devastating. Janice was permanently removed from her prestigious seat on the local charity board, and her once elite interior design business rapidly lost its wealthiest corporate clients. Society quietly shunned her as a greedy woman who maliciously exploited an orphaned child. Russell humbly moved into a small, remarkably plain rented apartment across town. He attempted to send me a lengthy, handwritten apology letter, but I instructed Howard to return it completely unopened. My former adoptive siblings didn't fare any better in the aftermath. Dean not only lost his extravagant wedding gift, but his engagement shattered completely when the truth emerged. His corporate mortgage firm promptly fired him to avoid being associated with a massive property trust scandal. Kelsey lost all of her lucrative brand deals overnight. Her old, arrogant videos bragging about the fake Caldwell family legacy became the subject of brutal internet mockery, forcing her to abandon her influencer dreams and find a regular minimum wage job to financially support herself. A local journalist named April Lawson eventually wrote an objective, factual article about the lawsuit based entirely on public court records. It wasn't a sensational smear piece, it was just the undeniable truth. Finally, I officially reclaimed Whitlock House. I didn't turn my childhood home into an arrogant trophy to flaunt my victory. Instead, I converted the sprawling ground floor into a funded support program, providing essential housing, legal resources, and career guidance for young adults who were actively transitioning out of the difficult foster care system. I didn't choose the traditional, heartwarming path of emotional forgiveness just to make the story sound pretty for the public. I chose safety. I permanently blocked Janice's personal phone number, refused all meetings with Russell, and stopped referring to Dean and Kelsey as my siblings. Any necessary lingering communication goes exclusively through Howard's firm. This entire ordeal taught me a vital lesson about true survival and self-worth. A family should never use the basic concept of childhood gratitude as a toxic weapon to control your entire life. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can possibly do is permanently close the door on the people who repeatedly hurt you and lock it behind them. Thank you so much for listening to my story all the way to the very end. If you have ever been treated like an unwanted outsider within your own family, please feel free to share your honest thoughts and personal experiences in the comments section below. I will be reading them.